The city of Sacramento in California is renowned for its sweltering summers and short winters. However, in November of 1988, the heat was even more intense and oppressive. The situation was so unbearable that most homes kept their windows shut and air conditioning units running at full capacity. Yet, some were facing an even worse predicament. Neighbors of a boarding house had been complaining for some time about the overwhelming stench coming from the backyard of a property owned by an elderly woman named Dorothea Puente. The odor was so unbearable that many avoided turning on their conditioning units, as the foul air was drawn directly into their homes. Several neighbors voiced their concerns directly to the elderly woman, who, smiling, claimed the smell was caused by sewage issues. At other times, she blamed rats that, according to her, were decomposing beneath the floorboards, or attributed the foul odor to the fish fertilizer she used in her garden. Neighbors frequently saw Dorothea attempting to mask the stench by spreading lime across the yard and pouring bleach. Meanwhile, the boarders at the house were enduring even worse conditions. They tried to avoid leaving the premises, but witnessed the elderly woman incessantly spraying lemon-scented air fresheners in the living room. Even so, the smell always returned, permeating the air as if it were poisoned. Few could have imagined that behind the calm smile and kind demeanor, there was a woman battling rats or plumbing issues, but someone capable of the most heinous crimes. The smell emanating from the backyard was the result of years of horrific acts committed against those who had once placed their trust in Dorothea Puente's care. Allow me to introduce myself. I am Alcioni Possamai, and welcome to another frightening episode of Lost Bones. Before we dive into the case, it is essential to emphasize that this is a story about maintaining appearances. At the time, Dorothea Puente worked hard to present herself as a respectable citizen in Sacramento, a woman who made charitable donations and mingled with lesser-known politicians. However, the sudden disappearance of her boarders would soon lead authorities to her doorstep, uncovering the horror hidden in her backyard. On the morning of November 11th, 1988, investigator John Cabrera of the Sacramento Police Department was dispatched to investigate a light-colored boarding house located on a quiet street in the city. That area had once been a wealthy neighborhood and a prime destination for affluent families traveling to California. However, by the late 1980s, the district was dominated by large, unused mansions, many of which were boarded up and abandoned. The ones still occupied were often converted into vintage-style boarding houses, much like the one John Cabrera and his colleagues were looking into. Their mission was to find a man named Alvaro Montoya, who had a mental disability and had been reported missing by his social worker. The social worker's suspicions were directly aimed at the boarding house's manager, Dorothea Helen Puente. As they approached the house, Cabrera and his team noticed a tall black iron fence enclosing the property. The boarding house was adorned with Christmas lights, and lace curtains hung in the windows, giving the place a cozy appearance, as if Dorothea paid meticulous attention to every detail. However, Cabrera's experience had taught him that first impressions were not always reliable. Without hesitation, they knocked on the door and were greeted by Dorothea herself. Direct and to the point, the investigator asked if they could inspect both the interior and exterior of the boarding house, and the elderly woman readily allowed them inside. The interior was filled with items typical of an older person's home: small vases, porcelain dolls, and decorative napkins. Though cluttered with knickknacks, the environment seemed serene. After a brief inspection of the house, Cabrera and his team moved to the backyard located at the southeast corner of the property. In the backyard, the team quickly noticed that the soil appeared to have been recently disturbed. The other officers returned to their patrol car to retrieve shovels and picks, intending to investigate what might be buried there. John Cabrera himself grabbed one of the shovels and began digging. Not long after, the shovel's blade unearthed pieces of fabric and what looked like dried flesh. With renewed determination, he continued digging until he encountered something that, at first glance, appeared to be a tree root. John climbed into the hole and grabbed the root, pulling it. To his shock, it was not a root, but a human bone. The discovery prompted an immediate reaction from John and the other officers. The commotion drew Dorothea out of the boarding house and into the backyard. When she saw the hole, she seemed alarmed as they informed her that they had uncovered what appeared to be human remains. According to John, Dorothea raised her hands to her face, wearing an expression of shock that felt more like theatrical pretense. The team continued digging but soon stopped when they uncovered part of a foot still inside a shoe. It was now evident that the remains belonged to a human. John called headquarters, and it was decided that the investigation would resume the next day with proper equipment. The boarding house was placed under 24-hour surveillance, and at that moment, Dorothea was not yet considered the main suspect. She was kept inside the residence. The following morning, on a Saturday, a team of forensic anthropologists from Sacramento, accompanied by officials from the medical examiner's office and a forensic team from the county, arrived at the boarding house with heavy machinery. Since part of the excavation had been completed the day before, the rest of the body was uncovered quickly. It appeared to belong to an elderly woman, as white hair was still attached to the decomposed remains. As the excavation continued, reporters from the Los Angeles Times and other newspapers began to surround the property. Teenagers and neighbors climbed trees in nearby yards to watch the police work from a distance. There was a significant commotion due to the overwhelming police presence, but the atmosphere grew even darker when the first freshly buried body was unearthed. The crowd watching from a distance adopted a morbid silence. Dorothea Puente, an elderly woman in her 60s, was beginning to take center stage in the unfolding story. Although she remained at the boarding house, journalists were already starting to suspect her involvement. However, the investigators still had no concrete evidence directly linking her to the bodies. On the second day of digging, Dorothea asked John Cabrera for permission to visit the Clarion Hotel next door for a cup of coffee. She was dressed in a striking cherry red overcoat, purple shoes, and carried a pink umbrella. John granted her request, unaware of the trouble this decision would cause. Dorothea walked to the hotel, but instead of entering, headed to the taxi stand and took a cab to the other side of town. Later, it was discovered that she went to a bar she frequented where she drank 4 glasses of vodka with grapefruit juice. She then took another taxi to Stockton, where she boarded a bus bound for Los Angeles. The bus ride lasted 6 hours. Carrying $3,000 in her purse, she seemed to have one goal in mind: to start a new life, completely ignoring the chaos unfolding at her property. Meanwhile, 3 more bodies had been discovered beneath a cement slab, and a 5th corpse was unearthed beneath a gazebo in the side yard. John Cabrera was both thrilled by the discoveries and deeply troubled, wondering what could have driven someone to murder these individuals. However, his focus soon shifted to a new problem. 4 hours had passed, and Dorothea Puente had not returned. A group of officers was sent to the Clarion Hotel, only to find that she had never even entered the building for coffee. By this time, Dorothea was already hundreds of kilometers away from the excavation site at her boarding house, prompting an intense manhunt for her whereabouts. With this turn of events, John and his colleagues became increasingly determined to uncover what Dorothea knew about the bodies buried in her backyard. While Dorothea Puente was still on the run, the investigation at the boarding house came to an end. In total, 7 bodies were discovered, all of whom were later identified as former tenants of the boarding house. The first victim, chronologically, was 78-year-old Betty May Palmer, who arrived at the boarding house on October 14, 1986. Later, investigations revealed that Dorothea had forged a Californian identification card with Betty's photo, likely after killing her. Additionally, 2 months after Betty's disappearance, the address for receiving her Social Security checks was changed to the boarding house. Further inquiries confirmed that Dorothea forged Betty's signature and cashed a benefits check for $7,000. Betty's body, dressed in a white nightgown, was found dismembered, missing her head, hands, and legs. Dorothea had carefully buried her beneath a statue of Saint Francis of Assisi, just a few meters from the sidewalk in front of the house. Although Betty's official identification would come later, suspicions already pointed toward her. Toxicology reports revealed the presence of doxylamine used to treat allergy symptoms and minor pain, as well as haloperidol and flurazepam, both prescriptions medications that had been prescribed to Betty. The next victim, chronologically, was 78-year-old Leona Carpenter. She was admitted to the boarding house in December of 1986 after being discharged from the hospital. In the months that followed, Leona remained bedridden on a sofa until her disappearance in February of 1987. Her body was the first to be uncovered by John Cabrera and his team. The third victim was 62-year-old James Gallup. He moved into Dorothea's boarding house in February of 1987, after surviving a heart attack and undergoing surgery to remove a brain tumor. However, he would not survive his stay with Dorothea. Shortly after his arrival, Dorothea contacted James' doctors to inform them that he had relocated to Los Angeles, after which he was never heard from again. His body was later found buried beneath a gazebo in the backyard of the boarding house. Later that same year, on October 2, 1987, 61-year-old Vera Faye Martin was sent to live at Dorothea's boarding house. Vera kept regular contact with her daughter, but suddenly the communication stopped. Her disappearance raised concerns, but the truth would not be revealed until the following year, when the horrors of the boarding house came to light. Vera's body was found buried inside a metal shed in the backyard. When her body was discovered, Vera was still wearing her wristwatch, which, surprisingly, was still ticking. Toxicology reports revealed the presence of flurazepam in her system, a medication used to aid with sleep. By late October of 1987, 65-year-old Dorothy Muller, a Native American woman, was placed under Dorothea Puente's care. Dorothy was last seen by her social worker, who told investigators she had seen Dorothy smoking a cigarette on the front porch of the boarding house. Dorothy was described as an elderly woman struggling with severe alcoholism who often recited bitter poems about love. In late November of 1987, a carpet cleaner was called to the boarding house to remove a pile of foul-smelling sludge from one of the rooms. According to investigations, this was Dorothy's room. After Dorothy's disappearance, Dorothea began forging her checks, collecting at least $11,000 in benefits. Dorothy's remains were discovered beneath a concrete slab near some rose bushes in the backyard. When her body was unearthed, her arms were bound to her chest with tape. Toxicology tests found both flurazepam and carbamazepine in her system. The second-to-last identified victim was 55-year-old Benjamin Feng, an alcoholic who arrived at the boarding house in March of 1988. His health was fragile, and his brother visited him weekly. In April, however, the brother was told that Benjamin had moved away, which concerned the family, but did not seem unusual enough to raise alarm. According to another tenant's testimony, a strong, horrible odor came from Benjamin's room, but Dorothea blamed the smell on plumbing issues in the house. Interestingly, it was discovered that Dorothea had ordered 12 bags of cement shortly before Benjamin Fink's disappearance. In June of 1988, a large hole was dug beside the door of the metal shed in the backyard of the boarding house. Benjamin Fink's body was found in this hole, wrapped in a plastic quilt, bound with duct tape, and covered with blue absorbent pads. According to another tenant, the last time Benjamin was seen, Dorothea mentioned that he had taken him to his room to help him feel a little better. The final identified victim was 51-year-old Alvaro Montoya, a schizophrenic man who often spoke to himself. Alvaro arrived at the boarding house in February of 1988 and was frequently seen addressing Dorothea as Mama. Investigators discovered that within a month of Alvaro's arrival, steps were taken to designate Dorothea as his beneficiary. According to the witnesses, in August of 1988, a man was seen removing Alvaro's clothes from the wardrobe in the boarding house. Although this raised some suspicion, Alvaro was still staying there at the time. However, he disappeared a few days later. When questioned about his absence, Dorothea claimed that Alvaro had gone to Mexico to visit relatives. The story sounded suspicious to the Sacramento social worker, who made several attempts to locate Alvaro without success. Later, Donato Antony, an accomplice and former convict, confessed that Dorothea had asked him to contact social services pretending to be Alvaro's brother-in-law. However, the Sacramento social worker became even more suspicious and warned Dorothea that she would call the police. A few days later, the social worker received a letter wrapped in a paper towel, supposedly signed by Alvaro's brother-in-law. The attempt seemed intended to divert suspicion, but it only intensified it. The social worker brought the letter to the authorities, who suspected that the wrapping was meant to avoid leaving fingerprints, prompting a formal investigation. Alvaro's body was eventually discovered buried beneath a newly planted apricot tree in the side yard. These details slowly emerged as the discovery in the backyard continued to pile up. Apparently, Dorothea Puente rented the first floor of her boarding house to individuals in need of care, primarily alcoholics or people in poor health. When police searched Dorothea's room, they found expensive perfumes and silk chiffon dresses, items that were clearly beyond the means of a typical pensioner. While Dorothea was on the run, the investigation at the boarding house intensified, uncovering several critical pieces of evidence. Among them was a hastily scribed note that caught investigators' attention. It listed the initials of each identified victim alongside the amount of money Dorothea had obtained from them. A quick analysis estimated that she earned at least $5,000 per month from her deceased tenants. Investigators also learned from the surviving tenants that Dorothea enforced strict rules within the boarding house. Tenants paid $350 per month, which covered a room and 2 daily meals. However, if they missed a meal, they were not allowed to eat later or often went hungry, as Dorothea prohibited access to the kitchen outside designated times. She also forbade the use of the house landline phone and ensured that tenants could not touch the mail. Drinking alcohol inside the house was strictly prohibited as well. Following Dorothea's trail, investigators discovered that she often took long walks to the cheapest bars in town. Her favorite spot was Harry's Lounge, where she was frequently seen chatting with lonely elderly patrons. She would pay for their drinks and seemingly ask questions about their financial situations. According to investigators, if Dorothea believed the elderly individual was worth the effort, she would invite them to move into her boarding house. One such person, 67-year-old John Terry, corroborated this account. He testified that during a conversation at the bar, Dorothea asked about his finances and employment. Afterward, she called him several times, trying to persuade him to move into the boarding house, but John declined her offers. On the other hand, a former tenant, 64-year-old retired cook John Sharp, described Dorothea almost as an angel. According to him, she fed stray cats, donated clothes and cigarettes to her tenants, and was always willing to help people. Because of these acts, Dorothea was known in the neighborhood for her kindness and was well regarded, especially by older men and local politicians. Interestingly, it was discovered that during Christmas, Dorothea often shared meat with her neighbors. This raised suspicions that the meat might have been human, but this was never confirmed, as was likely just regular animal meat. Another friend of Dorothea's, 54-year-old taxi driver Patty Casey, stated in an interview that she was a good friend. However, he also admitted that he often drove her to purchase cement, plants, and fertilizers or dropped her off at bars around Sacramento. Through Patty, investigators learned that Dorothea lied about her age. She had told him that her documents listed her as 60-year-old, but in reality, she was 71. Moreover, it appeared that Dorothea was financing plastic surgeries with the money she obtained from her victims. According to Patty, Dorothea was a pleasant and intelligent woman. However, he also recalled that once he noticed a foul odor at the boarding house, and when he asked her about it, Dorothea replied that it was caused by dead rats rotting beneath the house. While Dorothea remained on the run and with no leads to her whereabouts, police decided to delve deeper into her life. This exploration would lead to even more macabre discoveries. From the beginning of the investigation, the Sacramento police began constructing a criminal profile of Dorothea Puente. Through conversations with former tenants and those close to her, investigators noticed a recurring pattern. Before a tenant disappeared, Dorothea would always mention to someone that the person was not feeling well. She would then reassure them that the person would get better soon and take them to the second floor of the boarding house where she lived herself. Dorothea always had an excuse ready. Some tenants also observed peculiar behavior. Dorothea hated losing control. On one occasion, when a tenant suggested how she should manage the boarding house, she packed his belongings into cardboard boxes and threw them onto the street, effectively evicting him. Faced with this behavior, one tenant left without notice to live with relatives, apparently out of fear of Dorothea. The most significant discovery about Dorothea, however, was that while she appeared to be a benevolent elderly woman in Sacramento, her past was far darker. Although authorities initially avoided sharing details with the public, investigative journalists quickly uncovered who she really was. Soon, they pieced together her story and revealed without holding back the true nature of the boarding house owner, known for hiding bodies in her backyard. According to the investigations, Dorothea grew up in the city of Redlands, California. Her mother, Trudy May, had about 18 children, though she often claimed to be the youngest. Journalists discovered that Dorothea was actually the sixth child. Her father, Jesse James Gray, was a troubled alcoholic. During his drunken episodes, he would threaten to kill himself in front of his children. Jesse died of tuberculosis when Dorothea was only 8 years old, and a year later, her mother died in a motorcycle accident. After losing their parents, Dorothea and her siblings were sent to an orphanage, where she later reported experiencing sexual abuse. According to journalistic investigation, Dorothea went through several foster homes during her childhood. Using census records, it was discovered that at the age of 13, Dorothea lived with a family in Napa, California. By the time she was 16, school records indicated she was living in Los Angeles. Less than a year later, she relocated to Olympia, Washington. During the summer of 1945, in Olympia, Dorothea was known to her close acquaintances as Sherry. She worked at a milkshake shop and lived in a motel room with a friend, where they also took on side jobs as sex workers. Still 16 years old that same year, Dorothea met Fred McFall, a 22-year-old soldier who had just returned from the Philippines after serving in the World War II. In an interview, Fred stated that Dorothea knew she was beautiful and understood how to make money whenever she wanted. A few months later, the two married in Reno, Nevada. Interestingly, at the time of the wedding, Dorothea claimed to be 30 years old and gave her name as Shariale A. Resile, details that were officially recorded despite being lies. This was the first time Fred noticed Dorothea's compulsive lying. It became even more apparent when she began spending all their money on expensive clothing and fabricating stories about her past to seem more interesting. Some people close to her mentioned that Dorothea often claimed to have participated in the Bataan Death March, one of the most harrowing events of World War II, in which American and Filipino prisoners were forced to march for miles to Camp O'Donnell in Tarlac Province. The humane conditions, heat, and malaria caused the death of 650 Americans and 10,000 Filipinos before they reached the camp. Additionally, Dorothea claimed to have survived the Hiroshima bombing, to be the sister of a Swedish ambassador, and to be a close friend of actress Rita Hayworth. These extravagant lies were met with skepticism by her social circle, but no one seemed to take them seriously. Between 1946 and 1948, Dorothea and Fred lived in Gaudencio, Nevada, where they had 2 daughters. Shortly after the birth of their second daughter, Dorothea traveled to Los Angeles and became pregnant again, opting to have an abortion. One of her daughters was placed under the care of Fred's mother, while the other was put up for adoption. In 1948, Dorothea was arrested for stealing checks from an acquaintance, which she used to purchase a hat, a purse, stockings, and shoes. Upon her arrest, she pled guilty and was sentenced to 4 months in prison. During her incarceration, Fred left her. Dorothea was later released on parole for 3 years but soon fled the city. By the mid-1950s, she married Alex Johansson, a merchant sailor. Their marriage was tumultuous, primarily because Dorothea assumed the identity of Teya Singoala Neyarda, claiming to be a Muslim woman of supposed Egyptian and Israeli descent. Under this persona, she took advantage of Axel's long absences at sea, bringing men home and spending the couple's money on frivolous items. In 1960, Sacramento police arrested Dorothea for operating an accounting business that was, in reality, a front for a brothel. When questioned, she claimed she was merely visiting the premises and was unaware of its true nature. Despite her defense, she was found guilty and sentenced to 90 days in Sacramento County Jail. After her release, Dorothea attended a party fueled by alcohol, displaying self-destructive behavior and even attempting to take her own life. As a result, Axel had her committed to DeWitt State Hospital, where she was diagnosed as a pathological liar with an unstable personality. Although their marriage continued for another 5 years, the couple divorced in 1966. Following the divorce, Dorothea adopted the identity of Sharon Johansson, using Axel's last name to obscure her criminal past. With this new persona, she integrated herself into different social circles, presenting herself as a devout Christian and building a reputation as a caregiver. She also began supporting young women through a nonprofit institute focused on aiding impoverished and abused women. In 1968, inspired by her work, Dorothea opened her own recovery home for alcoholics called the Samaritans. That same year, a 39-year-old, she married 21-year-old Robert Joy Puente. However, The marriage ended quickly, and her recovery home amassed a debt of $10,000. During that tumultuous period, Dorothea attempted to legally divorce Robert, but he fled to Mexico, delaying the process until 1973. However, their relationship had become violent, and 2 years later, Dorothea filed for a restraining order against Robert. Although she never saw him again after that, for some reason she continued using his last name and became known as Dorothea Puente. Parallel to these events, Dorothea had already taken over the management of a boarding house in Sacramento. In 1976, she married Pedro Angel Montalvo, a 52-year-old tenant. However, the marriage ended quickly when Pedro realized Dorothea's disturbing personality. In an interview, he revealed that Dorothea demanded new stockings every day and lived under the delusion that they were wealthy. In 1978, Dorothea was convicted of forging 34 checks she had stolen from her tenants. Although she was sentenced to 5 years of probation, she was also required to attend therapy sessions with a psychiatrist who diagnosed her as schizophrenic and a very disturbed woman. With these revelations unearthed by investigators and journalists, it became clear that Dorothea had always been a woman with a deeply troubled history. However, the most intriguing event occurred in 1982 when something unusual began to unfold around her. That year, Ruth Monroy, a 61-year-old tenant of Dorothea, died of a massive overdose of Tylenol and codeine inside the boarding house. While Ruth had been battling a terminal illness, her death raised suspicions. Investigators also discovered that Dorothea and Ruth had formed a partnership to open a small cafe business. At the time, Dorothea was considered a suspect in Ruth's death. However, a month later, she was arrested and charged with drugging 4 elderly individuals and stealing their valuables. One of the victims later recounted that, despite being drugged, they witnessed Dorothea looting their home. The court sentenced her to 5 years in the California Institution for Women in Frontera. She was released 3 years later, in 1985, on the condition that she stay away from elderly individuals and avoid handling checks. Yet, almost immediately, she became involved with Everson Gilmouth, a 77-year-old man from Oregon. The two began living together in Dorothea's boarding house until Everson mysteriously disappeared. Everson Gilmouth's family did not notice his absence, as Dorothea spent the following year sending letters in his name pretending to be him. The truth behind Everson's disappearance would only come to light with the discovery of the bodies buried in the boarding house backyard. Until that revelation, Sacramento Social Services, unaware of Dorothea's past, routinely referred elderly individuals in need of care to her. Somehow, they failed to investigate her background or suspect her history of theft and drugging elderly victims. Instead, they saw only the image Dorothea projected, that of an elderly woman who seemed like an exemplary caregiver. She hosted Alcoholics Anonymous meetings and helped people apply for Social Security benefits. At first glance, Dorothea appeared to be just a pleasant elderly woman dressed in expensive clothes, wearing large glasses and sporting gray hair. She quickly established herself as a respected member of the local Hispanic community, funding charities, scholarships, and radio programs. In an interview, a former social worker revealed that 19 elderly individuals had been placed in Dorothea's care because her boarder house was considered the best that Sacramento system could offer. Other staff commented that this happened because Dorothea accepted the most difficult clients, drug addicts, alcoholics, and seniors who were physically or verbally abusive. Social worker Peggy Nickerson reported that she stopped sending seniors to the boarding house after witnessing Dorothea verbally abusing one of the residents. Tragically, Peggy later discovered that at least 4 of the seniors she had referred to the boarding house were among those buried in the backyard. In light of these revelations, the public was outraged to learn that vulnerable individuals had been effectively handed over to die at a boarding house. Subsequently, an independent agency in Sacramento County published a report criticizing the Sacramento Police Department and 10 other public and private agencies involved with the boarding house. Moreover, the absurdity of the situation became apparent when it was revealed that parole officers, who visited Dorothea 15 times during her 2-year parole period, failed to notice that she was running a boarding house for the elderly. She was openly violating her parole restrictions, even as many in the community were well aware of the boarding house's existence. It was only when the bodies began to be unearthed that the fatal oversight by these agencies became evident. The case created a moment of significant tension between the authorities and the public, and Dorothea's escape made the story even more terrifying. With the full truth about who Dorothea Puente really was now exposed, the hunt for her intensified, with authorities racing to locate her as quickly as possible. After all, they couldn't risk letting her remain free, knowing that Dorothea was an opportunist who would undoubtedly exploit any chance to make more money to fund her escape. A few days after her escape, as the public began to grasp the true nature of Dorothea Puente, her whereabouts were uncovered. The person responsible for this discovery was Charles Wilgus, a 59-year-old retired carpenter. He was having a beer one afternoon at a tavern called Monte Carlo in downtown Los Angeles when he noticed an elegant elderly woman sitting beside him. At first glance, Charles observed that she was well-dressed, wearing an expensive bright red coat. Without saying a word, the woman ordered a vodka with orange juice and then introduced herself to Charles as Donna Johansson, claiming to be from Sacramento. She added dramatically that her husband had passed away the previous month, and then she was now in Los Angeles to start a new life. To Charles, the elderly woman seemed like a typical widow who had inherited a fortune and was looking for a few marriage before the end of her days. Their conversation continued, and Donna mentioned that her time in Los Angeles had not begun smoothly. She explained that the taxi driver who dropped her off at the Royal Viking Motel where she was staying had driven off with her luggage. She also showed him her purple shoes, which were missing their heels, broken. Charles felt sorry for the woman, thinking that life seemed quite hard for her. Almost immediately, he took her shoes to a cobbler across the street to have them repaired. Upon returning to the tavern, Donna Johansson asked him a curious question: how much he received monthly from Social Security. Charles replied that he got about $576 per month, but found it odd when the elderly woman suggested they should live together, adding that she was an excellent cook. According to her, they were both lonely souls who could keep each other company from that moment on. Charles found the suggestion peculiar, but did not engage with the proposal. Taking a sip of his beer, he responded that he already had everything he needed in life. The two then went to a diner, spending a few more hours together until night fell, and they parted ways, promising to meet the following day to go shopping. When Charles returned to his apartment, he turned on the television and watched the news, which reported the gruesome discoveries in the backyard of Dorothea Puente's boarding house in Sacramento. He was deeply disturbed, realizing that the elderly woman he had met was identical to Dorothea. Quickly, Charles came to the conclusion that he had spent the day with a fugitive suspected of being a murderer. Not knowing what to do, Charles called a local TV station, which immediately contacted the police upon hearing his story. Meanwhile, Los Angeles police surrounded the Royal Viking Motel and arrested Dorothea. During the flight back to Sacramento, accompanied by authorities, Dorothea claimed that she had not killed anyone. However, when confronted with evidence, that investigators knew about the checks cashed in the names of the deceased, she simply stated that long before any of these happened, she had been a good person. In November of 1988, Sacramento investigators questioned her intensely, hoping for a confession. Although they gathered significant information, Dorothea steadfastly refused to admit to her crimes. The following month, authorities identified a body that had been discovered 2 years earlier by a fisherman in the Sacramento River. The corpse was inside a plywood coffin and was confirmed to be 77-year-old Everson Gilmouth. The body was wrapped in multiple plastic bags and covered with a sheet secured with duct tape. Mothballs and blue toilet deodorizer were also found inside the coffin. Investigations revealed that before his disappearance, Everson had been living at Dorothea Puente's boarding house, making her the prime suspect in the case. During the inquiry, it was uncovered that Dorothea had hired a handyman, Ismael Carrasco Flores, to build the box that would later be used to store Everson's body. After completing the box, Dorothea paid Ismael $800 and gave him the victim's vehicle. Ismael, apparently unaware that he had built a coffin or of the car's origin, later testified that Dorothea hired him again to dispose of the sealed and nailed box. He agreed to the task, driving about an hour to a remote area and dumping the box into the Sacramento River. The prosecution chose not to charge Ismael as an accomplice, provided that he testified against Dorothea. Finally, on March 31, 1989, Dorothea Puente appeared for the first time in Sacramento Municipal Court. She wore a blue dress and a pearl necklace. Coldly, she declared herself not guilty to 9 charges of murder. This plea ensured a trial would take place, with the prosecution seeking the harshest penalty possible. However, it would take 4 long years to process and organize all the evidence. The trial was officially scheduled for February of 1993, but due to the immense publicity the case had generated in Sacramento, the judge decided to relocate the proceedings to Monterey, California. During the trial, prosecutor John O'Mara portrayed Dorothea as a greedy serial predator who had murdered her tenants to steal their government checks. According to the prosecution, Dorothea was calculating and targeted individuals without relatives, friends, or concerned family members, people whose dads would not raise suspicions or questions. On the other hand, defense attorneys Peter Flauting and Kevin Climo argued that the tenants had died of natural causes. They claimed Dorothea avoided calling paramedics not to cover up murders, but because she did not want to draw attention to herself, as she was operating the boarding house in violation for her parole. In their opening statement, the defense attorneys depicted Dorothea as an elderly woman with a benevolent soul who cared for society's outcasts, those with nowhere else to go. They attempted to downplay the severity of the crimes, arguing that the money stolen from the tenants was barely enough to cover her expenses, and concluding that, while Dorothea had stolen their money, she was not a murderer. The prosecution, however, brought witnesses to dismantle this narrative, including handyman Ismael Carrasco Flores, who Dorothea had hired to build the coffin for Everson Gilmouth. In total, the prosecution presented approximately 153 witnesses, over 3,000 pieces of evidence, and a scale model of the Victorian boarding house to illustrate the findings for the jury. Additionally, they displayed photographs of the victims, first alive and smiling, and then their decomposing corpses as they were discovered in Dorothea's backyard. The jury watched everything with unease, while Dorothea Puente remained expressionless, showing no reaction. She seemed to be cultivating the image of an innocent grandmother, always dressed in floral prints and sporting a typical elderly woman hairstyle. However, the prosecution faced a significant challenge. They could not definitely prove how each of the victims had died. despite finding strong medications in their systems. Their only option was to call an expert witness who testified that while the drugs found in the victims were not lethal on their own, they could become fatal when mixed with alcohol or other medications, particularly for the elderly. One witness, Dorothy Miller's doctor, reported that Dorothea had attempted to fill a prescription using the victim's identification card, but the pharmacy refused her request. This behavior was corroborated by other witnesses who described Dorothea's habit of forcing medication onto her tenants. Carol Durning reinforced these claims, recounting that victim James Gallup had confided in her that Dorothea was giving him drugs that caused him to sleep for extended periods. An employee from the Sacramento Disintoxication Center also testified that Alvaro Montoya, another victim, had reported that Dorothea was giving him a bitter and unpleasant medicine. The same employee stated that they confronted Dorothea, who became enraged and threatened to take Alvaro elsewhere if they continued to interfere with her care. The prosecution also brought in a handwriting expert who confirmed that Dorothea had forged the signatures of 7 deceased tenants on 60 federal and state checks. These checks were sent directly to her boarding house, earning her approximately $5,000. However, the prosecution used this evidence only as additional support, choosing not to charge Dorothea with forgery to avoid complicating the case for the jury. In response, defense attorney Kevin Climo admitted that Dorothea was a thief with a compulsion for stealing, but argued that this did not make her an evil serial killer. The prosecution witness, Homer Myers, who lived in Dorothea Puente's boarding house for 2 years after meeting her at a bar, revealed that, unknowingly, he had dug some of the graves for her tenants. Dorothea had asked him to dig a 4-foot-deep hole to plant a small apricot tree. Homer later suspected that the grave might have been intended for him, but at some point, he refused to sign documents related to his Social Security benefits, leading to his eviction from the boarding house. Given the gravity of the case, the court invited the jury to visit Dorothea's residence, particularly the backyard where the victims were discovered. They were also taken to the bars where she hunted for her victims, and through the narrow rooms of the boarding house where many tenants were given cocktails of sleeping pills, slowly drifting from unconsciousness to death. One juror, Joy Martin, shared that he felt something deeply unsettling when walking through the garden, describing a strange, heavy sensation in the air. After a year of deliberation, the jury found Dorothea Puente guilty of the murders of Dorothy Miller, Benjamin Fink, and Leona Carpenter. However, they could not reach a unanimous verdict on the other 6 murder charges, including that of Everson Gilmouth, despite the direct testimony from the handyman who helped dispose of the body in the river. As a result, Superior Court Judge Michael Verga declared a mistrial on those charges. The jury's inability to agree on these counts sparked debates, as many believed there was sufficient evidence to convict her of more murders. Nevertheless, this did not impact her final sentence. On December 10, 1993, Dorothea Puente, at 64 years old, was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She was sent to the Central California Women's Facility near Chowchilla, the largest women's prison in the United States. During her years in prison, Dorothea continued to claim innocence, maintaining that all the people buried in her backyard had died of natural causes without her involvement. On March 27, 2011, Dorothea passed away at the age of 82 from natural causes related to old age. Today, Dorothea Puente is regarded as one of the deadliest serial killers, and although she was not convicted for all the cases, the Sacramento police still consider her the prime suspect in each one. It is estimated that her number of victims ranges between 9 and 15, all vulnerable individuals who once trusted the sweet granny of death.